Tonight, what was once only murmured among Western intelligence circles and cryptically alluded to in Russian state-controlled media has now burst into the open, revealing perhaps the most severe internal fracture within the Kremlin's war apparatus since the start of the Ukraine invasion. A serious and growing conflict has emerged between President Vladimir Putin and his top military officials, one that risks shaking the fragile foundation of Russia's wartime leadership. A combination of Western intelligence leaks, intercepted communications, and insider reports from within Russia paint a picture of deep internal dissent. President Putin, once seemingly in lockstep with his military leadership, now appears to be facing fierce resistance from the defense ministry and senior commanders. This isn't just squabbling over battlefield tactics, these are sharp divisions over broader strategy mobilization plans and the overarching narrative Russia has spun to justify the war. The timing couldn't be worse for the Kremlin. Ukrainian forces are pushing forward with relentless momentum, while Russia's capacity to maintain a long-term war of attrition seems increasingly doubtful. The situation suggests an unraveling within the command structure that may ultimately influence not just battlefield outcomes, but the internal balance of power at the highest levels of Russian governance. What appears to have ignited this open conflict was the dramatic failure of Russian forces in northeastern Ukraine. During a rapid Ukrainian offensive near Kharkiv, Russian troops reportedly retreated in disarray, abandoning stockpiles of modern weapons and long-held defensive positions. NATO analysts believe Russian generals had previously warned of the dangers of spreading forces too thin across multiple fronts. These warnings, however, were ignored. The Kremlin allegedly insisted on continued offensives in the Donbass, hoping to stage a symbolic victory before September. The fallout from this strategic blunder has not stayed behind closed doors. Criticism is now emerging from several powerful factions, each pushing their own version of events. Most prominently, the feud between the traditional military hierarchy Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Chief of General Staff Valery Gerasimov, and more unorthodox players like Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov and Wagner Group's Yevgeny Prigozhin has escalated dramatically. While Kadyrov and Prigozhin aren't part of the formal military command, they've taken to their massive Telegram audiences to denounce Shoigu and Gerasimov, accusing them of incompetence, poor planning, and even sabotage. Prigozhin, in particular, has made provocative video statements claiming that Wagner forces succeeded in key battles like Soledar and Bakhmut despite the regular army's failures. Such public feuding is nearly unheard of in Putin's Russia, where internal disputes are traditionally handled behind the scenes and loyalty is strictly enforced. The fact that these criticisms continue unpunished has led many to believe that Putin may be using them to shift blame onto the military, distancing himself from the mounting failures without directly accepting responsibility. However, the disagreements run far deeper than a public relations war between rival warlords in the defense ministry. According to sources familiar with U.S. and European intelligence, the core conflict is between the General Staff's assessment of the war's realities and the Kremlin's political demands. The military command, facing staggering losses in personnel and equipment, estimated by Western officials to exceed 80,000 killed and tens of thousands more wounded, has reportedly pushed for a full-scale nationwide mobilization since the summer. Their argument, grounded in grim arithmetic, is that the current force of contract soldiers and volunteers is insufficient to hold the more than 1,000-kilometer front line, let alone secure any further meaningful gains. They have also advocated for a shift to a purely defensive posture to consolidate gains, rebuild units, and weather the winter, while grinding down Ukrainian forces and Western resolve. This pragmatic, if grim, assessment has clashed directly with the political imperatives of the Putin presidency. President Putin, analysts suggest, is constrained by a different set of calculations. A full, honest mobilization would involve calling up hundreds of thousands of reservists, shuttering factories to shift to a full war economy, and essentially announcing to the Russian population that the special military operation is in fact a major war requiring national sacrifice. Such a move carries immense political risk. It could shatter the carefully cultivated narrative of a limited necessary operation proceeding according to plan, potentially triggering widespread public discontent, panic, and a flight from the country reminiscent of the exodus that followed the initial invasion announcement. The Kremlin's polling and internal security assessments are believed to have warned that while public support for the operation remains passive, active, large-scale sacrifice could turn that passivity into anger, particularly among the urban middle classes who have so far been largely insulated. Furthermore, declaring a formal war could have severe international legal and economic consequences, potentially justifying even more direct NATO involvement. Therefore, Putin's response, the partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists announced in late September, is seen by many military analysts as a politically hesitant compromise that fails to meet the military's stated needs while still incurring significant political costs. This disconnect between the scale of the problem and the scale of the response is a core source of tension. The historical context of civil-military relations in Russia makes this moment particularly volatile. Since the time of the Tsars, the relationship between the Russian ruler and the military high command has been fraught, marked by periods of brutal subjugation under Stalin and chaotic independence under Yeltsin. Vladimir Putin, a former KGB officer, has traditionally viewed the military through the lens of a security operative. He has worked to ensure its loyalty through financial patronage. The promotion of trusted allies like Shoigu, a longtime friend with a civilian background in emergency response, not professional soldiering, and the fostering of competition between different security structures, including the Army, the National Guard, and private military companies. This system of divide and rule was designed to prevent any single institution from becoming powerful enough to challenge the president. For over 2 decades, it worked. The military received vast sums for modernization showcased in Syria and remained a pliant political tool. The war in Ukraine has shattered that equilibrium. The military, now actually fighting for its existence and reputation, is being asked to achieve impossible objectives with inadequate resources and its professional core. The mid-level and senior officers who are bearing the brunt of the fighting is increasingly disillusioned. The old methods of control are straining under the weight of failure. The economic dimension of these disagreements is equally critical and adds another layer of pressure on the Kremlin. The Russian Ministry of Finance and the central bank, led by technocrats like Alva Nabulina, are engaged in their own quiet struggle with the military and security bloc. Their priority is to preserve macroeconomic stability, prevent a complete collapse of the ruble, and manage the country's financial reserves in the face of the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed on a major economy. The military's demands for a massive increase in war spending on everything from artillery shells and missiles to uniforms and salaries for hundreds of thousands of new recruits threaten to blow apart the federal budget, unleash inflationary fires, and drain the National Wealth Fund. There are reports of intense behind-the-scenes debates over the allocation of dwindling resources. Should funds be directed to social payments and subsidies to keep the population quiescent, or to the military-industrial complex to replenish staggering losses of tanks and armored vehicles? The mobilization itself is an enormous economic shock, pulling hundreds of thousands of men, many of them skilled workers or professionals, out of the civilian economy, further exacerbating labor shortages created by the earlier exodus. This economic triage creates a silent but potent conflict between the guns and butter factions within the Russian government, with Putin ultimately forced to arbitrate between them, pleasing none fully. On the social front, the mobilization order has acted as a seismic event, revealing deep cracks in Russian society's acceptance of the war. While state television continues to broadcast a narrative of patriotic resistance against NATO, the reality on the ground is one of localized trauma and growing anxiety. The mobilization, often implemented with chaotic and inequitable conscription practices, has disproportionately affected rural areas and ethnic minorities, sparking protests in republics like Dagestan and Buria. The sight of recruited men receiving minimal training and ancient equipment has circulated widely on social media, undermining the image of a modern professional military. This social discontent does not directly translate into political opposition capable of challenging Putin, but it creates a volatile background noise of resentment and fear that constrains the Kremlin's options. The military command, acutely aware of the morale crisis within its ranks, is likely arguing that further escalations without proper societal preparation risk breaking the army from within. The Kremlin, meanwhile, is betting that a combination of propaganda repression and the slow drip nature of the partial mobilization will allow it to manage this discontent without systemic crisis. Internationally, these internal Russian tensions are being watched with intense scrutiny and are directly influencing the strategic calculations of both Kyiv and the West. Ukrainian military planners have stated that the evident disarray and leadership conflict within the Russian system presents a unique opportunity to press their counteroffensives. The apparent disconnect between the Russian General Staff's desire to regroup and the Kremlin's refusal to authorize major territorial concessions creates a situation where Russian forces may be ordered to hold untenable positions for political reasons, making them vulnerable to further Ukrainian breakthroughs. For Western allies, the fractures validate the strategy of supporting Ukraine with advanced weapons and maintaining severe economic pressure. The assessment is that the Russian war machine and the political system that directs it is under a strain that could compound over time. However, there is also caution. A cornered, paranoid Kremlin facing pressure from its own military could become more unpredictable, not less. Discussions in Western capitals increasingly revolve around scenarios of escalation management, including the safeguarding of Ukraine's civilian infrastructure and the potential for the use of unconventional weapons by a Russian leadership that feels its strategic position and perhaps its own survival is at stake. Expert analysis of the situation points to several key indicators that will define how this crisis in Russian civil-military relations evolves. The first is the fate of Minister Shoigu and Chief Gerasimov. While they have been the targets of relentless criticism, they remain in place, suggesting Putin still values their loyalty over military competence. Their removal, especially if replaced by a harder-line, more combat-oriented officer, would signal a decisive victory for the faction demanding a more ruthless and total war approach. The second indicator is the implementation of mobilization. Will it remain a chaotic partial process, or will it evolve into a more systematic, larger-scale draft that effectively places the economy on a full war footing? The third is the state of the battlefield as winter sets in. A successful Ukrainian advance that threatens critical logistical hubs or even the land bridge to Crimea could force a decisive moment, compelling either a dramatic military escalation or a forced, humiliating political reassessment. Finally, the behavior of the Siloviki, the powerful leaders of other security services, will be crucial if figures like Alexander Portnikov of the FSB or Viktor Zolotov of the National Guard begin to distance themselves from the military's failures or align with critics like Prigozhin. It would signify a fundamental realignment of power within the Putin system. What happens next will be determined by the resolution of this fundamental tension between military necessity and political survivability. The Russian military as an institution requires resources, manpower, and rational strategy to avoid further degradation and potentially catastrophic defeat on the battlefield. The Putin presidency requires the maintenance of domestic stability, the preservation of a narrative of control and inevitable victory, and the avoidance of steps that could trigger uncontrolled political fallout. These requirements are now in direct conflict. The war has exited the realm of distant statecraft and entered the core of the Russian political system, testing its foundations. The reported disagreements are not merely about tactics on a map in Ukraine. They are about the distribution of power, blame, and resources in Moscow, and about who will bear the ultimate responsibility for a war that is rapidly turning into the defining and potentially destabilizing event of Putin's long rule. The pressure is building from the front lines, from the economy, and from within the very structures that have propped up the regime. How the Kremlin manages this pressure, whether through reconciliation purges or a dramatic escalation, will shape the next and perhaps most dangerous phase of the conflict. The consequences of the escalating tension between the Kremlin and the military command are now manifesting in tangible and dangerous ways on the ground in Ukraine and within Russia's political architecture. The reported disagreements have evolved from behind-the-scenes friction into a driving factor of Russian operational military decisions, often to the detriment of its own forces. Intelligence analyses from Western military agencies indicate that the compromised position, the partial mobilization, has failed to resolve the fundamental manpower crisis and has instead created new severe problems. The hurried training and deployment of mobilized reservists, often lasting mere weeks, have resulted in units with poor cohesion and low morale being fed into active combat zones. This has not provided the qualitative reinforcement needed to stabilize front lines, but has instead increased casualty rates without yielding strategic gains. Furthermore, the need to equip these new forces has stripped training centers and storage depots of serviceable equipment, further degrading the long-term readiness of the military. The internal conflict has thus directly translated into operational weakness, forcing Russian commanders to make untenable choices, such as relinquishing tactically significant ground in Korone to avoid a potential encirclement. A decision that itself caused significant political fallout in Moscow. Politically, the rift has catalyzed a quiet but intense struggle for influence and survival among the Russian elite. The system of managed competition that Putin fostered is showing signs of becoming unmanageable. While the public attacks from figures like Prigozhin and Kadyrov continue, the more significant battles are occurring in private. Factional lines are hardening. The Siloviki bloc, comprising leaders of various security services, is reportedly divided. Some, likely within the FSB's internal security apparatus, are aligned with the military's frustration over the poor planning and intelligence failures that preceded the invasion. Others see an opportunity to undermine the Ministry of Defense and expand their own empires. The economic technocrats, meanwhile, are fighting a rearguard action to prevent a full-scale looting of the state budget for military procurement, warning of hyperinflation and the collapse of essential services. Putin's role has shifted from ultimate strategist to chief arbiter of these disputes, a position that consumes political capital and forces him into reactive piecemeal decisions. This constant crisis management is eroding the image of the decisive, all-knowing leader that has been central to his public persona for over 2 decades. Economically, the strain of prosecuting a war amid internal discord is pushing Russia toward a precipice. The sanctions regime, designed to be a slow-acting toxin, is working in concert with massive unplanned wartime expenditures. The government deficit is ballooning as military spending sources and energy revenues begin to falter under the weight of price caps and embargoes. The critical decision to mobilize hundreds of thousands of men is exacerbating a pre-existing labor shortage, crippling industries from it to construction. This internal economic pressure directly feeds back into the political-military conflict. The General Staff demands more resources for a wider war, while the Finance Ministry warns that providing them will trigger an economic crisis that could destabilize the country more surely than any battlefield defeat. Russia is now caught in a vicious cycle. Military setbacks demand greater mobilization and spending, which weakens the economy and society, which in turn limits the capacity to achieve military success. This cycle is unsustainable in the long term, and the competing power centers within Russia are each offering different mutually exclusive paths to break it. Socially, the war's penetration into everyday Russian life is deepening, and the state's control over the narrative is fraying. The mobilization order pierced the bubble of detachment for millions of families. The use of distributed, decentralized recruitment methods has led to widespread distrust and attempts to evade service, undermining the social contract. While overt, large-scale protest remains dangerous and rare, passive resistance, localized dissent, and a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety and gloom have become endemic. This social mood directly impacts military effectiveness. Reports from the front consistently cite poor morale among newly mobilized troops, a factor in their low combat performance. The state's attempt to manage this by tightening censorship, promoting hyper-patriotic propaganda, and further repressing dissent is a sign of weakness, not strength. It indicates the Kremlin recognizes the fragility of public acquiescence. The military leadership is undoubtedly aware that an army drawn from a disgruntled, fearful society is a brittle instrument, adding another layer to their arguments for a more realistic, less politically driven strategy. The international reaction to Russia's internal turmoil has been one of calibrated observation. Ukraine and its Western backers have not interpreted the discord as a sign of imminent collapse, but as a vulnerability to be exploited. Military aid packages have become more sophisticated and longer term, aimed at enabling Ukraine to sustain pressure through the winter and into 2024, testing the resilience of a fractured Russian system. Diplomatic efforts, however, face a new complexity. With apparent competing power centers in Moscow, it is unclear who, if anyone, has the authority to negotiate meaningfully on behalf of the Russian state. This ambiguity makes any potential for ceasefire or diplomacy even more remote, as would-be mediators cannot identify a stable counterpart. For nations on the global sidelines, particularly in the global south, Russia's visible struggles have diminished its aura of inevitable strength, potentially influencing their calculations regarding arms deals, energy partnerships, and diplomatic alignments. Looking ahead, the trajectory of this internal Russian conflict points towards several potential inflection points, none without significant risk. The coming winter will serve as a severe test. If Ukrainian forces continue to make incremental gains under harsh conditions, the pressure on the Russian military and, by extension, on the Kremlin will intensify, potentially forcing a dramatic decision. One path is further escalation, which could include a formal declaration of war, a more total mobilization, or asymmetric actions against NATO supply lines. Another path is a forced strategic contraction, abandoning the goal of controlling all of Donbass and consolidating a smaller, more defensible land bridge to Crimea. Either choice would represent a victory for one of the competing factions within the system and a defeat for another, likely requiring significant purges or reshufflings to enforce the new line. The stability of the Putin regime itself is now inextricably linked to the war's outcome. A protracted stalemate with no clear victory narrative may be manageable, but a clear and unambiguous defeat could unravel the patron-client networks and fear-based compliance that hold the system together. The reported disagreements are more than a policy dispute. They are the symptoms of a system in profound stress, where the costs of failure are no longer abstract but are being counted in lost territory, shattered military prestige, economic hardship, and ultimately in the shifting loyalties of the very elites upon whom Putin's power rests. The war in Ukraine has become a catalyst for a crisis of authority in Moscow, the final resolution of which will determine not only the future of Ukraine but the nature of the Russian state for a generation.